Nebraska's Democratic primary takes place in May, and for the first time, independent voters can participate in the Democratic nomination contest. But Nebraska Democratic Chair Jane Kleeb, she argues that rural voters are often ignored by that party.
In her book, Harvest the Vote, How Democrats Can Win Again in Rural America, she highlights why this voting bloc is so significant and how to win them back. And she joins us now via Skype to discuss her book and the primary. Jane, it's great to see you.
Oh, it's good to see you again, Crystal.
All right, so what's the case that you make in the book? Why'd you want to write it?
You know, when we fought the Keystone XL pipeline, nobody in Washington, D.C. thought Nebraska farmers, ranchers, and tribal nations would be the hero in that story. The traditional script for political campaigns is that you walk the halls of Congress and you try to convince members of Congress to be on your side. We really showed the climate movement that you have to go to people who are most impacted by the issue in order to get them more engaged, and that's how you convince political leaders to make change. So that not only applies to climate change, it applies to immigration, it applies to breaking up big ag, it applies to breaking up big tech. So Nebraska Democrats know this, but the National Democratic Party has failed to invest in red and rural state parties, and this book makes the case on why that's critical.
And so, Jane, I mean, to push a little bit, which is that I look at the numbers. The Wall Street Journal just came out. 80% of farm counties have approval of Donald Trump across the nation. Why do you think that is? And why is there such a deficit for the Democratic Party in states like Nebraska in a farm county?
Democrats haven't showed up to farm country since the farm crisis in the 80s. And so I tell one story in the book where a farmer comes to a political campaign town hall of a Democrat and says, look, I'm sitting back here and I'm agreeing with everything that you're saying. I'm shaking my head in agreement, but I'm a Republican. And you know why? Because if there's only one church in town, guess what denomination you become? So that is a big red flag for Democrats to say, we have failed to show up. We have failed to stand with farmers and ranchers when they have been getting the rug pulled out from under them. And instead, we often demonize farmers and ranchers, or we demonize communities of color in our rural areas rather than standing with them when they need us the most.
I mean, we really invisibilize them in a lot of respects. You know, when I lived in Kentucky, this was something I saw consistently. It's not even so much about the issue stances in a lot of respects, you know, especially the sort of in Nebraska and Kentucky, more populous parts of the heartland. There's actually a lot of overlap in terms of economic issues, but they get a lot of contempt and condescension, frankly, coming from the National Democratic Party. No person is going to vote for a party that fundamentally has contempt for them.
That's right. In the Green New Deal, you know, when that rollout happened, mind you, the policy and the ideas in Green New Deal are great and will be very helpful for rural America. But the frame around it was that farmers and ranchers are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And I'm sorry, but big ag is. Family farmers and ranchers are the reasons we don't have Keystone XL and we don't have fracking in certain areas of Pennsylvania and Ohio. So we should be standing with folks. And, you know, there's little things like the right to repair. Farmers are really arguing that we need the right to repair. That make no sense in urban America. But when you take your iPhone, if it breaks, you take it to a stand in the mall, it devoids your contract. Well, the same thing for farmers. They can't fix their own tractors because of the way that big ag has contracts over the technology in their tractors. They just want to fix their tractors at home.
It's a monopoly issue. And that's a stranglehold. You know, J.D. Shelton is a friend. He's running against Steve King in Iowa for this big rural district in Iowa. He's really educated me on a lot of these issues. But part of why farmers and family farmers in particular are having such a hard time is because of consolidation monopoly. It seems like if Democrats would get smart on that and be aggressive and actually listen to people, as you point out, and show up on those issues, there could be an opening there over time. I mean, you don't just flip a switch, right? This is a long-term investment. But there is a lot of ideological potential overlap there.
That's right. And I know people's eyes are on the U.S. Senate right now for the impeachment hearings, even though we're not going to see any evidence or witnesses, apparently. But one of the problems is by 2040, 50% of the Senate seats will be represented by 84% of the population. So there is a big problem. If we really care about the U.S. Senate, if we care about climate policies at the state level, we have to start closing the margins in rural communities. We may not win the majority in rural communities, but we used to win 40%. We got to get back there. We got to start showing up.
And so which of the candidates right now do you think is really speaking to that message?
You know, I was going to bring up J.D. Shelton, and I'm glad that Crystal did. You know, J.D. does these small these small things on Twitter and Facebook where he talks about the small towns he's going to, and he always identifies the population amount, 681, 1,002. That may seem like a small thing to people in urban areas, but we take a lot of pride in our small towns about how many people are still there holding down the fort, if you will, and really trying to bring back, rural economy. So JD's doing a great job. Honestly, all of the presidential candidates, because Iowa is first in the nation, have a rural platform. But my big, red flag to the Democratic Party is we can't just talk about rural when we're in Iowa. Every single state across the United States has rural communities. It should be a bedrock of what we're talking about all the time.
And Jane, what is the conversation on immigration like in farming communities?
This is where I think there's a lot of stereotypes and misunderstanding. There's no question that there's racism in rural America, just like there's racism in our big cities. But what I see with farmers and ranchers is they can't get their product to the market. Nobody's going to be cutting up the product in the meatpacking houses. Nobody's going to be in the field shoulder to shoulder with the family farmers and ranchers if we don't have common sense immigration. So what I'm seeing in small towns is actually farmers and ranchers are actually buying homes for their workers because they can't get a loan from their community banks because they're undocumented. Our kids are playing with each other on soccer teams. They're going to school with each other. We're going to church together. So there's a lot of community, and that happens when you start to break down barriers and you actually start to meet people as human beings. And so we need to start thinking about how do we break up this stranglehold in immigration policy. And I think you do that with rural people at the table.
An interesting conversation. Thank you, Jane. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to have your perspective.
Thanks, guys.
Great to see you.
Up next, Team Rising is going to dive deep into that latest CNN poll. That One Rising continues.